Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Daphne Steriatis, and I'm an associate with CAQH CORE. Welcome to our CAQH CORE Participant Forum. So a couple logistical items. The slides and webinar recording will be emailed to all of you in the next couple of days. We'll also be posting everything to our website. Questions can be submitted at any time using the questions panel on the GoToWebinar dashboard. Before I hand the call over, I'd like to go over the session outline for today. We're going to start off with an overview of our voting process, and then our task group co-chair, one of our task group co-chairs and CAQH CORE staff will go over the various rule sets, and then we'll move on to the certification test suites, followed by the final CAQH CORE vote, and then we'll leave some time for Q&A. I'd like to give a thank you to our speakers. We're joined today by Patrick Murda from Humana, and who is the co-chair of the CAQH CORE Connectivity and Security Workgroup. And then, of course, our core staff, Emily, Aaron, and Lena. So I'll hand the core over to CAQH CORE Director, Aaron Weber.
Thanks, Daphne, and thanks everyone for joining us today. This is an important webinar, so we appreciate you taking the time out of your Friday afternoon to hear an update on some of the rule development efforts that have been occurring over the past year that now require some engagement across the core participation membership. So just a quick reminder on slide 6, we have a very strict voting process to approve new and updated operating rules here at CAQH CORE. All of the rules are developed through subgroups and task groups, which are informal processes, and then they move on to a work group, which from that level 2 up on this slide, we have quorum and approval requirements for each level of voting for the rules. So at the work group level, it's 60% of all organizations must approve by a simple majority. At the full core voting membership level, only those participating organizations that implement the rules or use the transactions can vote. That's a long-standing pillar or principle at CAQH because the feeling is that it's those organizations that have to make the financial and resource investment to implement the rules that should have that last say at the participant level. This level requires 60% quorum of all of those voting members, and a 2/3 approval vote is needed. Then any new or updated rules go to the core board for final approval. If at any stage in this process a rule does not meet the quorum or approval requirements, it'll be sent back to the previous level for revisions to respond to any feedback that has come through. On slide 7, I want to highlight the 2 work streams that we are going to be talking about today. Many of you have participated in these efforts throughout 2020. We have our value-based payment initiative, which has been going since 2019 and led to the development of some new attribution operating rules for exchanging patient attribution information between a health plan and a provider. Those rules have now completed the review work group ballot, or I believe that was level 2 on the last slide. They received 82% and 92% approval respectively, and also met all quorum requirements. In a separate process, core participants have also been working this year to update the CAQH CORE connectivity requirements. The Connectivity and Security Workgroup has been meeting for several months to update that rule, and recently completed its workgroup ballot on an updated version 4 rule, which received 83% approval at that level 2 workgroup level in the voting process, as well as meeting quorum requirements. So both of these work streams are now converging because they are both at that stage where we need to conduct that level 3 final CAQH CORE vote. So that ballot will be sent to all core participating organizations on Monday. and you will have 2 questions on that ballot. One will be to approve whether or not you support, do not support, or would like to abstain on voting on the new attribution rules, and whether you support, do not support, or abstain voting on the updated core connectivity rule. So the purpose of today's presentation is to give an overview of these new and updated operating rule requirements so that you are fully prepared to complete that ballot, and talk a little bit more in detail about how we came to, how the core participants came to the particular requirements. Next slide. We're going to start our presentation with some background on those new attribution operating rules. On the next slide, again, I'm used to speaking to a broader audience than just the core participants, so I know I need to give you all a little bit less background since you're up to date on the work of CAQH CORE. But for the last couple of years, there has been a strong focus from the CAQH CORE board on aligning our work with value-based payments and identifying opportunities where operating rules could help smooth the implementation and exchange of information related to value-based payments. So we have identified a number of opportunity areas, and at the end of last year, and we can move on to the next slide, formed an advisory group to consider some overarching opportunity areas and really identify much more specific opportunity areas to prioritize for operating rule development. So I just want to recognize here the core participating organizations that provided subject matter experts to participate in that group and guide the work. On the next slide, you'll see that that advisory group spent a lot of time looking at the traditional fee-for-service revenue cycle and comparing it to where pain points were caused for those participating in value-based payment contracts. The group ultimately came up with a list of 15 opportunity areas and then strongly prioritized the 5 opportunities that you see on this slide. That included exchanging patient and provider attribution information in a timely manner. Additionally, patient risk identification prior to the point of service, as well as the inclusion of expanded code sets on claims, were also prioritized by the group. Next slide, please. So I'm going to specifically focus on patient attribution, which is the work that we're talking about today and the focus of the new operating rules that are up for ballot. The research and the advisory group really felt that and heard from providers and plans alike that there are a lot of challenges with sharing attribution information. Providers have a lot of questions about it. They often aren't aware of the methodology being used to assign patients to them. They may not always be clear on whether they are the responsible party. It can get confusing with certain patients who may use a specialist who may act as their PCP, but they may be attributed to another PCP. And how do you coordinate those efforts? And similarly, understanding who else might be involved in a patient's care. These were all challenges we heard in the research related to attribution, but the number one challenge, and probably the most important before you can address any of these other ones, is to ensure that providers are clear on which patients are included in their attributed population. And so that's the challenge that the value-based payments subgroup tackled this year with the new rules. If you look at the next slide, you can see kind of the typical process for exchanging patient attribution information today. You know, a patient schedules an appointment with a provider, they go kind of through the traditional process, provider submits claim. Meanwhile, kind of in the background, the provider is receiving updated patient rosters from the health plans in which they are in value-based contracts for. These rosters may come on a monthly basis, they may come on a quarterly basis. We even heard of some coming on an annual basis, and the format of these rosters and the data within the rosters varied as well, from Excel files to FTP files. So it's very difficult for providers to automate or use this information in real time as they're seeing patients, and often they're not able to connect that information to their billing process, which means at the end of the year, they may not have submitted or shared all of the information they need to fully satisfy the terms of the contract. So the subgroup came together on slide 14 to develop some more standardized data content requirements to think about how to improve the exchange infrastructure around when this information should be shared between the two groups, and also to specify the formats in which the information should be exchanged so that it's consistent across the industry. The subgroup felt that focusing on the current X12 transactions is really meeting the industry where it is today and ensuring that anything that came out of the subgroup was going to be able to be easily implemented now. But of course, we'll continue to track new and emerging standards like FHIR as they are developed, tested, and implemented for future opportunities and to assure alignment with other initiatives. I'm going fast because we have a lot of information for you all today. So out of that work came really kind of two sets of operating rules on slide 15 related to the exchange of patient attribution. The first is the single patient attribution status data content rule. This rule relates to the eligibility transaction, and so it will be coupled with the eligibility operating rule set, and it requires a health plan to return the patient attribution status and effective dates of that attribution within the eligibility transaction so that the provider knows at the point of service whether or not an individual patient is attributed to them. Secondly, there is a set of rules, both a data content and an infrastructure rule, similar to all of our other operating rules, related to the exchange of the attributed patient roster. So the full list of patients that had been attributed to a particular provider. And the rule includes minimum data content that must be exchanged to help identify these patients, as well as expectations for when that information is exchanged, in this case, at least once per month. So there's 3 new operating rules that have come out of this work. One for the eligibility transaction, and the attributed patient roster rule set apply to a version of the 834 member reporting transaction, which I will now, I believe, oh, actually not quite yet, but which Lena will talk about in just a second. Before I turn it over to Lena, I just want to highlight on slide 16 and thank Troy Smith, who served as co-chair of this work effort. Troy is also a CAQH CORE board member. We also had over 50 participating organizations contribute to the development of these 3 operating rules. And so we're very grateful for the time and energy you all have spent on this over the year as well. Finally, the next slide gives you a bit of a timeline to demonstrate where we are in this process and what has occurred to date. These rules have been well vetted, validated, and straw polled many times. And so we are here at this point now looking at a final core participant vote. I wanted to highlight too that within our value-based payments efforts, our next focus will be on quality measure reporting using the claim transaction, and that was prioritized also by the advisory group. So if you're interested in learning more about that pilot, feel free to reach out to us as well. Now I will turn it over to Lena Governor-Merriam, who is a core manager who led a lot of the work for the development of these rules, to talk in detail about the rule requirements. Lena?
Thank you, Erin. So if we go to the next slide, please, we're going to start with the eligibility and benefits 270, 271, single patient attribution data content rule, and that is a mouthful. This data content rule will focus on the eligibility and benefits transaction. This is the most common transaction conducted between a provider and a health plan. And so this draft rule builds on the existing mandated operating rules that CAQH CORE has. And what it does is it allows in that request for a health plan to provide the attribution status of a single patient by using extended data content. So since the industry adoption rate is about 84% for eligibility inquiries, this will help create a consistent pathway for providers and health plans as they communicate a single patient attribution status. Next slide, please. So as I said previously, the single patient attribution status data content rule builds on those mandated CAQH CORE operating rules, formerly known as Rules 1 and 2, currently known as the eligibility and benefits rule package. So these federally mandated requirements set data content, infrastructure, and connectivity when exchanging the 270 and 271. What this rule does is it expands on that data content aspect. So if you go to the next slide, you'll start seeing when this rule applies. So the value-based payment subgroup worked for almost 6 months working on these rules. And they decided for both sets of rules that we'll talk about today to limit the scope of these rules to only cover value-based payment models that cover most patient services. So they decided to limit the scope by applying these rules only to the most expansive EVP models with the simplest attribution methodologies, and later on test more complicated methodologies. So these rule requirements apply when a patient is in the health plan system. A health plan is conducting attribution for an overall patient services VP model, which we categorize as HPC lands category 3 and 4 alternative payment models, excluding those episode and service-specific models. And finally, this rule applies whenever the mandated eligibility and benefits rules also apply. So when a plan or an information source receives a generic 50/10/270 request, or a health plan receives an explicit 270 with the service type codes that are covered in that eligibility rule. Again, this does not apply when a provider conducts attribution status for the support of episode or service specific models, aka bundled payments, or quality measures. Next slide, please. So now we get to the sort of meat and potatoes of the data content rule. So this sets the requirements which enable the return of patient attribution information within that 271 response. This requires conformance to the existing mandated rules. It requires the return of an explicit attribution status and effective dates of attribution for the patient identified in this request and response. These attribution status definitions are yes, no, partial, or not applicable. The health plan or information receiver is also required to explicitly state the exact wording of this data content message segment when extracting it for display purposes. Next slide, please. So moving on to the attributed patient roster data content and infrastructure rules. As Erin was talking about earlier, when a provider is viewing their attributed patients, most of the time they're getting these large files as FTP downloads, as emails, of just a list of patients, and the data content within that can vary, but also the format in which they're receiving it can also vary. So the idea here was to standardize both that data content and that format to sort of allow more seamless integration into a provider's existing workflow. So the subgroup decided to use the benefit enrollment transaction for this operating rule set. And of the 3 versions, they decided to use the plan member reporting transaction, since this was already designed to transfer member information both directly to providers and through intermediaries. So the data content rule specifies the loops, segments, and data elements to be used in this transaction to send providers a current list of their attributed patients. Next slide, please. Again, this rule has the limited scope of excluding value-based payment contracts associated with specific service or bundled payments. Next slide, please. So this data content rule requires conformance with the currently published and adopted CAQH CORE connectivity rule. It also requires that a health plan or its agent using this transaction to deliver a roster of patients identifies the provider, and those loops and segments on how to do that are defined, as well as the subscribers and dependents that are covered by the value-based health plan contract. health plans are also required to provide that name of the health plan contract for easy identification. And also, if deemed permissible, identifying of any other attributed providers for that subscriber or dependent. Next slide, please. So now that we have the data content set, it's important that we have an infrastructure rule to support this X318 member plan reporting transaction. As you're all familiar with, CORE often has a data content rule and an infrastructure rule to support a given transaction. So while we do have an infrastructure rule for the 220 benefit enrollment transaction, the differences in the directionality for how the plan member reporting works requires its own infrastructure rule. So when the regular benefit enrollment transaction, this is going from an employer to a health plan. But now we are removing that employer and adding the provider to it. So this is more of a one-way push or a pickup from a secure mailbox. We want to make sure that those infrastructure requirements sit only on the recipient of this information, only on the sender of this information, the health plan, and not the recipient. Next slide, please. So similar to all other CAQH core infrastructure rules, specifically those more like that one-way push and mailbox pickup, which would be our electronic remittance advice infrastructure rule. We have connectivity, system availability, acknowledgements, and companion guide requirements to support the exchange of this 318-834 transaction. The subgroup also drafted a time requirement that comes along with this. So Aaron was saying, when we have rosters being pushed out monthly, quarterly, or even annually, we want to create a cadence that providers can really rely on to get more standardized updates and sort of count on when their attributed patient rosters are going to arrive and make sure that information is accurate. So this infrastructure rule has a monthly exchange requirement, which requires a health plan and their agents to make an updated patient roster available via the transaction at least once per month. So when we say updated patient rosters, this includes updated effective dates of attribution wherever applicable, as well as new patients and the removal of old patients. Next slide, please. So now we want to look at that same workflow that Aaron walked us through, but now with the application of these operating rules. So now when a provider sends an eligibility and benefit request, earlier in the workflow, they're now getting a response as to whether or not that patient actually belongs in their attributed population, which means that they can, earlier in the year and along with that visit, submit any process measures, outcomes measures along with their claims to make sure that they are keeping track with the requirements of that value-based contract. Furthermore, instead of sporadically receiving different formats, via different connectivity methods, providers will receive monthly patient rosters via standard format in conformance with the attributed patient roster rule set, which will allow for data to be more easily integrated into the provider system. Next slide, please. And so with that, I will hand it off to Emily Tenay to walk us through the connectivity rule update. Emily?
Thanks, Lena. So now we are going to transition from the VBP rules to the connectivity rule version 4, which will also be validated in this upcoming vote. On the next slide, we will see. Okay, I think it's frozen. On the next slide, we'll see a comparison of the stages of the core connectivity rules that have existed over time. As core participants, many of you know that there have been these 3 published versions of core connectivity requirements in the past. And I'm not going to get into the details of each of these versions, but just really want to highlight that the first 2 versions established the core connectivity requirements, and those are currently federally mandated. However, these requirements, if you have been involved since the very beginning, were established and developed over 10 years ago. So what our version 3 does is really modernize the requirements established in those first two versions by streamlining transport standards, establishing more robust authentication security measures, and including specific metadata requirements. And this version applies to all transactions currently addressed by core operating rules. So version 4 of the core connectivity rules, which is what we're voting on in this upcoming vote, is an update to version 3. So it applies to all transactions addressed by CAQH core operating rules still, including claim and prior authorization attachment rules that are currently in development. So this version is really aiming to support clinical and administrative data exchange by adding requirements that will support REST and other API technology. So again, the final core vote and the requirements we are reviewing today all pertain to this most recent updated version 4. Next slide, please. So as the Connectivity and Security Work Group launched in February of this year to update these connectivity requirements, there are 3 main goals that were initially identified. First, we really wanted to align the core connectivity rule requirements to help support some of the frameworks proposed in the CMS and ONC interoperability rules, so that some of those more technical specifications would align with where the industry is headed as it continues to progress. The second was looking at establishing and updating the core connectivity safe harbor requirements, making sure that, again, we're supporting existing technologies that have been established in core connectivity, such as SOAP, but also looking forward to what's emerging with RESTful APIs. So in that way, we can really ensure that the safe harbor is able to support both standards that exist today and is also flexible enough to support some more modern approaches as we really work to improve interoperability. And finally, as the work group thought ahead to the future core initiatives, particularly with the value-based payment operating rules that we're discussing today and the attachments operating rules in development, wanted to ensure that a single uniform core connectivity rule was created that supports that intersection of both administrative and clinical data exchange. So here we have a high-level summary of some of the key updates that version 4 contains. We're going to cover this in just a few slides, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it here, other than to say that these updates really align with our goals that I just described to modernize existing connectivity requirements. Next slide, please. So I'd like to take a brief moment here to give a really big thank you to our co-chairs, Megan Sorcoso from Cigna, Michael Pravat from Availity, and of course, Patrick Murda from Humana, who you'll hear from on this presentation. Their guidance and work on these requirements was really invaluable. We also had over 25 additional core participating organizations representing all stakeholder types participate in this update, and we thank those participating organizations as well for all the time and support on this effort. Next slide, please. So now, before I hand the call to Patrick, I'd just like to show the timeline of development for the connectivity update. As I mentioned, our work officially started in February of this year with the launch of the work group. And after launching, the work group really worked hard over the next few months to identify and agree to opportunity areas and then develop the updates to the draft requirements by completing several surveys, straw polls, participating in multiple discussions and calls, and really coming to a consensus on what requirements to include and specifically how to draft and update those. As Erin mentioned earlier in the presentation, the work group officially balloted the updated connectivity rule in September of this year, and the draft requirements far exceeded all quorums and approval levels that she went over in that first section. So now I'll hand the call over to our workgroup co-chair, Patrick Murda, to talk in some more detail about the connectivity rule version 4 requirements. Patrick?
Great, thank you, Emily. Before we get started, I know we've got quite a bit to go through. I did want to highlight that the requirements in version 4 of the CAQH Core Connectivity Rule are split into 2 sections. First, we have the updated SOAP requirements, and second, we have the new REST requirements. We're going to start by reviewing the updates to the SOAP requirements. If we could go to the next slide, please. As mentioned, the draft rule applies to both SOAP and REST requirements, meaning the scope of the rule is identical to both sets of requirements. The updated scope specifies that the requirements apply when trading partners exchange X12 transactions specified in the CAQH Core Operating Rules, both published and those in development, such as the attachments transaction. The table that you see on the slide here shows a summary of the key changes to the SOAP requirements that were established in version 3. As you can see, the majority of the SOAP requirements specified in version 3 remain unchanged, as the goal of this update was to really modernize the existing SOAP requirements and to better align with emerging standards such as RESTful APIs. The key changes include updating security requirements to TLS 1.2 or higher, adding support for OAuth 2 client authorization, and as mentioned before, adding support for the X12 275 attachment transaction. On the next slide, we'll take a look at the authentication and authorization requirements. The SOAP authentication requirements specifies that HIPAA-covered entities and their agents must support X509 mutual authentication over TLS 1.2 or higher. This is unchanged from version 3, aside from the updated security specification of TLS 1.2 or higher. The SOAP authorization requirement is new with this update and specifies that health plans must support OAuth 2 client authorization. Providers and their agents may optionally use OAuth 2.0 when exchanging messages using SOAP. This is an important distinction because, as we'll see later in the discussion, this new requirement applies optionally to providers when exchanging messages using SOAP, but applies to both health plans and providers when using REST. Can we go to the next slide, please? Now we're going to transition to the new REST requirements. As a reminder, this is an update to version 3 of Core Connectivity, which did not include REST requirements. Here we see a high-level overview of the key REST requirements. As mentioned previously, the scope of the SOAP and REST requirements is identical. So, again, the REST requirements apply when trading partners exchange any X12 transaction specified in the CAQH Core Operating Rules. I'd like to highlight that while the rule specifically applies when trading partners are exchanging X12 transactions specified in the CAQH Core Operating Rules, the rule remains payload agnostic, meaning that the SOAP and REST services are not aware of the underlying content they are serving, and the rule may be applied to non-X12 payload types such as HL7 CCDA, PDF, Word documents, etc. Many of the REST standards and requirements align with the updated SOAP requirements, and we see those highlighted in the blue blocks here on the right side of the screen. The areas in the purple box are the new REST requirements connectivity areas. Each of these areas consistently received exceptionally high support on the feedback forms and straw polls for their inclusion in the draft rule update. We'll walk through some of the key requirements that fall into these areas on the following slides, but please note that not all of the requirements will be covered in detail in this webinar. Next slide, please. Similar to the standards specified for the SOAP message transport, the draft REST requirements specify REST API interface format and authentication and authorization requirements for REST exchanges. These requirements include that JSON must be used to exchange REST messages to reduce variations and enable greater interoperability in the industry. Additionally, mirroring the SOAP authentication requirement, The REST authentication requirement specifies support for X509 mutual authentication. However, as we mentioned in the SOAP section, the REST authorization requirement differs in that it specifies that all HIPAA-covered entities and their agents must support OAuth 2 when exchanging messages using REST. Next slide, please. The next REST requirement we'll look at pertains to specifying REST versioning. Workgroup members consistently provided feedback that enabling version navigation and discovery, as well as simplifying version management, would be beneficial for entities implementing REST. The REST requirements specify that versioning for REST APIs should be maintained via the URI path. In order to communicate the use of the safe harbor, which we'll discuss in just a bit, versioning of the CAQH core connectivity rule should also be maintained via the URI path. Here we see an example of versioning management, specifying the REST API version where the yellow highlighted text refers to a modifiable version variable. Next slide, please. The next key requirement, or the next key new requirement, specifies API endpoint naming conventions. In this requirement, each X12 transaction set points to a specific payload type. In the rule, an API endpoint refers to one end of a communication channel where you locate and access a resource to carry out a function. The draft requirements for the API endpoints require the use of standard naming conventions. I'll call your attention to the table on the right with the columns labeled endpoint name. This is meant to streamline and support uniform REST implementations. The endpoint names listed in the table were drafted to align to various X12 payloads. It is important to mention again here that the rule, both SOAP and the REST requirements, are payload agnostic. This means the rule requirements support other non-normative, non-X12 payloads. This was a critical component for the group as it enables the rule to support a variety of data types and allows capability with existing and emerging standards. As the industry continues to evolve, the rule may be updated to include normative non-X12 payloads. Next slide, please. The next requirement is around REST HTTP request and response metadata. Similar to the SOAP metadata specified in the rule, the table contains parameter fields, descriptions, intended use, values, and examples. The parameters contained in the rule serve as a basis of what is required by the core REST requirements, but additional parameters may be added by entities as needed. Again, the metadata included establish a floor and not a ceiling in terms of what an entity may include. Next slide, please. This slide describes a critical concept to core connectivity that the workgroup voted to include in the update, the safe harbor concept. As in previous core connectivity rules, version 4 of the core connectivity rule is a safe harbor for the exchange of SOAP and REST messages. And as such, specific conformance requirements apply to stakeholders that choose to implement the rule. Health plans or clearinghouses must support all connectivity methods, so both SOAP and REST requirements. Those are the servers on the screen. Providers or vendors, clients, must support at least one connectivity method, so either SOAP or REST. This is a key component of core connectivity because although trading partners may choose to utilize other connectivity methods, if the trading partner insists on using the core safe harbor, that request must be accommodated. Next slide, please. On this slide, we see the key existing SOAP connectivity requirements included in version 3 of the core connectivity rule that we discussed earlier in the discussion. So I won't go over them again here in detail. On the right side of the slide, we see the updates to these SOAP requirements, which were summarized a few slides back. As we just covered, there are also a number of new REST requirements included in this update that serve as a bridge between the existing and emerging standards and protocols. One main goal of the work group was to continue to ensure industry needs are met as technology continues to progress, and the addition of those REST requirements aim to achieve that goal. As mentioned on the summary slide, additional REST requirements, including additional support for HTTP methods such as post and get to exchange messages, and support for HTTP error handling and status error codes. Those are summarized here. Again, each of these requirements aim to modernize the existing core connectivity requirements that were updated in the draft rule that will be included in the final core vote. With that, I'll hand the presentation back over to Aaron to discuss the associated core certification test suites. Aaron?
Thanks, Patrick. As you all know, with all of our CAQH core operating rules, we offer core certification as well. And this is really when you see the conformance requirements within these new and updated rules, they all relate to core certification. To date, we've awarded over 380 core certifications, and they're really a way for trading partners to demonstrate their commitment to administrative simplification, uniformity, and adherence to some of the federally mandated operating rules. So if you move to the next slide, included in the ballot for each of these rule packages, for the value-based payment rule package for the attributed rules, we have included the updated eligibility and benefits core certification test suite, which will include new test scenarios to test and certify implementations of the single patient attribution data content rule. As I mentioned, that attributed patient roster rule set will become its own independent rule set with its own test suite. So there's also a new test suite to align with that infrastructure and data content rule. So for those patient attribution rules, we have the updated eligibility certification test suite, and then the new attributed patient roster certification test suite. For core connectivity, there will be no test suite included in the ballot because the testing requirements for connectivity and security are already incorporated into the other core certification test suites, because connectivity applies to each of the operating rule sets. The rule requirements will be updated, and the certification test suite will be updated as this rule becomes required across the various rule sets for core certification. So the next steps, just to summarize everything we've talked about today, the vote, like I said, is going to go out on Monday. We ask that you work with your internal teams at your organization to review these operating rules in detail. We'll be sending out the rules with the ballot on Monday if you already haven't dug into them. Consider how the rules are going to impact the healthcare system at large. We have a set of evaluation criteria we use as we're developing the rules, and I ask that you consider the impact these rules will have in creating some greater uniformity and reducing burden around patient attribution, as well as advancing our connectivity requirements to align with some of the newer interoperability efforts we're seeing across the industry. The ballot will be sent to primary representatives at the core participating organizations, along with any contacts from those organizations who participated in the rule development process. So if you participated or you are the primary rep for your organization, you should receive the ballot on Monday. Again, there will be 2 items that you will need to vote on, one for each rule package: your support, non-support, or abstention on the connectivity rule update and on the new patient attribution rules. The ballot will be open starting Monday and close on Friday, December 4th. It's really hard to believe we're already talking about December here. The ballots must be completed via the online link, and the results will be shared via email with core participants following the ballot period. Obviously, as always, your responses and comments will be kept strictly confidential. Next slide, please. So once again, we just wanted to include a summary slide here at the end with everything that will be included on the final core ballot that will go to those organizations that participate in core and will implement, would be implementers of these rules. So you have the new draft CAQH core attribution rules, the single patient attribution data content rule with the eligibility transaction, and the data content and infrastructure attributed patient roster rule set as well. Along with that, you have the updated certification test suite for eligibility and the new attributed patient roster certification test suite. Then within the connectivity rule update, you will have the updated SOAP requirements and the new REST requirements to review. As always, core staff, the co-chairs of these groups are available to talk with your organization if you have any questions on the requirements. Also, we'll be sharing this recording on Monday with the ballot. So if you think anyone from your organization could benefit from hearing an overview of the rules, that certainly will be available as well. So with that, I think I will turn it back over to the team for any questions.
Thanks, Erin. Thank you to all of our speakers for the informative presentation. I want to encourage you all to submit your questions in the questions bar on the right of your screen. So since our last topic was certification, let's start with a question on when will certification be available?
Thanks, Stephanie. I can answer that. As always with our certification process, once the operating rules are approved through that full core voting process, so once the if the rules pass this ballot with the final all core vote, they will then go to the core board for final review and approval. Once the board has approved the rule set, we will be working with our core certification testing vendor to build out the test suites for the new and updated operating rules. That typically takes about 6 months or so. So we would anticipate beta testing to begin for these rules probably in the summer of 2021 at some point.
Wonderful, thanks, Erin. Second question, I am the voting member, but not the right person on connectivity. How do I connect with the right person on my team in order to know how the rules might affect my organization?
That's a great question. And Emily, yeah, go ahead.
Yep. Yeah, that's a really great question. And especially with this vote, they'll be covering both the VBP and the connectivity rules. So maybe one person won't be the subject matter expert for both. So we will be including a PDF, a fillable PDF with the launch email that goes out on Monday. And we do encourage the primary representative of each of your organizations to connect with the people within your organization who do have that subject matter knowledge, and they can use that fillable PDF to give their feedback on the topic, and then that primary representative's role is really to submit the one vote on behalf of the organization. But that collaboration ahead of time is really, really key and important.
Thanks so much, Emily. And of course, please don't hesitate to reach out to any of the members of our staff if you have any follow-up questions. We're here to help and provide support. Thank you so much for joining us today. Like I said, please don't hesitate to reach out either at the CORE inbox, core@cqh.org, or to any of the members on the CORE staff. Thanks so much and hope you all have a great afternoon.